Welcome to my channel. Are you ready? Bed? Lean back, immerse yourself in the story. Experience fristed and off to sleep peacefully. They were celebrated in poetry and carved in marble. Their names were whispered in the Senate and shouted in the streets. In a civilization that produced Julius Caesar, Augustus, and Marcus Aurelius. Some of the most powerful forces were women. Women whose beauty was not merely an aesthetic fact, but a political instrument, a social currency, and, in several cases, a weapon sharper than any legionary's gladius. This is the story of what it actually meant to be a beautiful woman in ancient Rome. The luxury and the confinement, influence and the danger. The extraordinary lengths to which these women went to achieve and maintain the ideal of beauty their world demanded, and the remarkable lives they led, within, and sometimes far beyond, the boundaries that Roman society tried to impose on them. Ancient Rome's relationship, female, was as complicated as it was obsessive. Roman men wrote about beautiful women constantly. In love poetry that rivals anything produced since, in political histories that noted a woman's appearance with the same attention they gave to a general's tactics. In philosophical texts that tried to explain why beauty was dangerous and failed to make the argument convincingly. The ideal Roman beauty, as described across centuries of Latin literature, had pale skin, dark eyes, full lips, dark hair arranged in elaborate configurations, a tall and graceful carriage, and small, well-formed hands. She moved with dignity. She smelled of rosewater and cinnamon. She was educated enough to be interesting, but not so educated as to be threatening. A balance that very few women in Roman history actually managed to strike, and that many of the most fascinating ones deliberately refused to attempt. The women we will follow in this documentary are drawn from a range of social positions, from the imperial palace to the prosperous merchant class, from the celebrated courtesans of the port cities to the educated wives of senators. What they share is the experience of inhabiting a world that simultaneously idealized and constrained them, that worshipped beauty while regulating the women who possessed it, and that produced, despite itself, and sometimes because of the very pressures it exerted, some of the most remarkable female lives of the ancient world. Their stories are not simple. They are not the stories of victims, and they are not the stories of triumphant heroines. They are the stories of human beings navigating a system that was not designed for their benefit, using every tool available to them, and leaving traces in the historical record that 3,000 years have not entirely erased. Chapter 1. The Romance Ideal. What beauty meant in the ancient world. The canon of feminine beauty. To understand the lives of Rome's most beautiful women, we must first understand what Roman society meant by beauty. Because the Rome ideal was both specific and culturally constructed, shaped by centuries of Greek influence, by the particular light of the Mediterranean world, and by the social and political assumptions of a civilization built on hierarchy and display. The Roman writer Ovid, whose two major works on the subject, the Ars Amatoria and the Medicamina Faciae Feminae, remain the most detailed surviving accounts of Roman beauty culture, describes the ideal female face with the precision of a portrait painter, a forehead that is smooth and neither too high nor too low, eyebrows that are arched but not too steeply, eyes that are large, dark, and bright, a nose that is neither too long nor too short, and that catches the light pleasantly, lips that are full but well-defined, teeth that are white and even, cheeks that are smooth and faintly flushed. This ideal was Mediterranean in its specifics. The pale, fair-haired beauty that would dominate Northern European aesthetics in later centuries was present in Rome as an exotic attraction. The blonde hair of German and Gallic captives was genuinely admired. And the wig makers of Rome did excellent business supplying wealthy women with blonde hairpieces made from the shaved heads of northern prisoners of war. But it was not the dominant ideal. The canonical Roman beauty was dark-eyed, dark-browed, with hair that could be raven black or deep chestnut brown, elaborately styled, richly oiled, and fragrant. The skin was supposed to be pale. Pallorness indicated that you do not labor in the sun, which was a social distinction of the first importance. But the darkness of the eyes and the richness of the hair provided the contrast that Roman aesthetics found most pleasing. Height and carriage were also significant components of the Roman beauty ideal. The women described in Latin literature as particularly beautiful are consistently described as tall or at least well-proportioned, and they move with the dignified bearing that Roman culture associated with noble birth and good education. The poet Horace describes his ideal woman as one who knows how to arrange her limbs gracefully, whether she is sitting, standing, or walking. The poet Propertus, in his elegies to his mistress Cynthia, whose real name was probably Biliohostia, the granddaughter of a Latin poet, describes her not only in terms of her face and hair, in terms of her entire physical presence. The way she carries herself, the quality of her movement, the way her appearance changes depending on the light and the angle from which she is observed. These are the observations of a man who has looked very carefully at a particular woman. But they also articulate something broader about what Roman culture valued in female beauty. It was not a static quality to be captured in a single image, but a dynamic presence that animated a room. Beauty as social status in ancient Rome, beauty was not simply an aesthetic quality. It was as a form of social capital with real economic and political consequences. A beautiful woman of good family was worth more on the marriage market. Her dowry might be negotiated at a higher level. Her suitors were more numerous and of higher status, and her prospects for a strategically advantageous marriage were significantly better than those of a less attractive woman. Of a woman's birth, a beautiful woman without family connections could, in certain circumstances, use her beauty to acquire the patronage of wealthy men and gain access to a social world that her birth would not otherwise have admitted her to. And a beautiful woman who was already of high status could use her appearance as an instrument of political influence in ways that her male contemporaries sometimes found deeply threatening. The Roman legal and social system attempted to regulate female beauty as it attempted to regulate everything else about women's public presence. Sumptuary laws, legislation limiting the display of luxury, were repeatedly passed and repeatedly ignored as wealthy women continued to wear silk, to drip with jewelry, and to appear in public in the elaborate coiffures and heavy cosmetics that announced their status to anyone who saw them. The philosopher Seneca, complaining about the luxury of his era, describes women whose clothing was essentially transparent, whose necks were weighed down with multiple strands of pearls, and whose spending on adornment consumed the income of substantial estates. He is complaining, but his complaint is also a vivid description. And what it describes is a world in which female beauty was extensively performed, expensively maintained, and publicly displayed with a confidence that the written rules of Roman social life did not entirely endorse. The tension between the idealization of female beauty and the anxiety it produced in Roman male culture runs through the entire literary record of the period. Beautiful women were celebrated in poetry, pursued with extravagant devotion, and then condemned in the same texts for the power their beauty gave them. The Latin love elegists Ovid, Propertius, Tibullus, Catullus are simultaneously the most devoted admirers of female beauty in ancient literature and its most resentful victims. Their poems oscillate between worship and reproach, between the ecstasy of a woman's presence and the misery of her absence or indifference, in a pattern that reveals the fundamental instability of a culture that has assigned enormous social power to female attractiveness while simultaneously insisting that women have no proper claim to power of any kind. 8 Chapter 20 The morning ritual, beauty regimens of Roman women. Before, for the mirror, the morning toilet of a wealthy Roman woman was a production of considerable complexity, duration, and expense. It was not a private act. It was a social performance conducted in the presence of a team of specialized slaves whose entire professional existence was dedicated to the creation and maintenance of their mistress's appearance. A wealthy Roman woman of the 1st or 2nd centuries ECE might have a permanent staff of personal attendants that included a hairdresser, typically a female slave trained in the elaborate art of Roman coiffure, along with one or more cosmete slaves whose role was the application of cosmetics, and additional attendants responsible for the care of clothing, jewelry, and the various preparations. They are part of the daily beauty routine. The process speak with bathing. Roman bathing culture was, by the standards of most of the ancient world, unusually sophisticated, and wealthy women had access to bathing facilities in their own homes, as well as to the great public baths that were among the most remarkable architectural achievements of the Roman Empire. The private bath of a wealthy household typically included both a cold plunge pool and a heated bathing room, and the water was scented with oils of various kinds: almond oil, olive oil, oil of roses, oil of myrtle, that were applied to the skin during and after bathing. Pumice stone was used to remove body hair. A practice is considered essential to the Roman ideal of female beauty and described in matter-of-fact terms in numerous Latin texts. After bathing, the skin was anointed with more oil, then dusted with fine white powder made from chalk or lead carbonate to achieve the pale, matte finish that was the foundation of Roman feminine appearance. The use of lead-based compounds in Roman cosmetics is one of the most disturbing aspects of ancient beauty culture when viewed through a modern lens. Lead carbonate, white lead, known in Latin as cerussa, was the most highly valued whitening agent in the Roman cosmetic arsenal, used both as a face powder and mixed with water, fat, to produce a foundation cream that smoothed the appearance of the skin and gave it the intense pallor that was the beauty standard. That lead is a cumulative neurological toxin that causes severe health problems with long-term exposure. Was not known to Roman women or to the physicians who sometimes prescribed cosmetic preparations containing it. The effects of chronic lead exposure headaches, cognitive changes, mood disturbance. Ultimately, organ failure may well have contributed to the documented health problems of women who used these preparations throughout their adult lives. The beauty they were purchasing came at a price they did not know paying. The architecture of hair. If Roman cosmetic culture was elaborate, Roman hairdressing was an art form. The hairstyles of Roman women across the imperial period represent some of the most technically ambitious and visually spectacular achievements of personal adornment in the entire ancient world. And they are documented in extraordinary detail both by the written sources and by the sculptural portraits that have survived in considerable numbers. The ornatrix, the female slave who specialized in hair, was one of the most skilled and valuable members of a wealthy woman's household staff. Her work required not only manual dexterity and artistic judgment, but also a detailed knowledge of hair care, the use of heated irons for curling, the application of various setting preparations made from plant gland gums and animal fats, and the techniques of hairpiece attachment that extended a natural head of hair into the architectural confections that the portrait sculptures record. The hairstyles of the Flavian period, the late 1st century CE, during the reigns of Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, represent perhaps the most extreme flowering of Roman coiffure. The characteristic Flavian style for wealthy women, in towering structure of curls above the forehead, built up on a wire frame and supplemented with hair pieces that add several inches to the apparent height of the hair. The curls were made by winding sections hair round heat-heated iron rods, a process that required both skill and care to avoid burning the hair or the scalp. The result, as captured in the portrait busts of the period, is a head of hair that seems almost physically impossible. A dense mass, tight ringlets rising from the face in a perfectly symmetrical composition that must have required hours to produce and constant care to maintain throughout the day. The poet Juvenal, who was not generally sympathetic the pretensions of wealthy Roman women, describes the morning hairdressing session with the savage comedy of an observer who has watched the process too many times. The mistress examines her face in the mirror while the onyx works, pulling at a strand here and adjusting a curl there, while the unfortunate slave must endure the blame for any imperfection in the result. A badly placed pin might earn the ornatrix a beating. A curl that fell during a dinner party was a disaster for which the slave would pay the following morning. Juvenal's description is satirical. It captures something real about the dynamics of the beauty routine. The enormous labor that went into it, the genuine skill required of the slaves who performed it, and the way that the performance of feminine beauty in Roman society rested on the invisible and unacknowledged work of enslaved women. Perfumes and cosmetics. The Roman cosmetic industry was a significant sector of the ancient economy, supplying a demand for beauty products that ranged from simple olive oil preparations to extraordinarily expensive imported substances. Coal made from antimony sulfide was used to darken the eyes and line the lids, a practice imported from Egypt and the Near East that gave the eyes the enlarged, darkened appearance that Roman aesthetics considered ideal. Ochre and fucus, a red preparation made from various sources including plant extracts and mineral compounds, were applied to the cheeks and lips to provide the flush of color that was considered part of the ideal feminine appearance. A powder made from ground deer antler was used as a dentifrice. Charcoal was sometimes added to whiten the teeth. The perfume trade was one of the most profitable luxury industries of the Roman Empire, and in the sense that wealthy women were among the most expensive commodities in the ancient world. Nard, spikenard, came from the Himalayan foothills of India and was worth its weight in silver. Cinnamon from Sri Lanka, frankincense and myrrh from the Arabian Peninsula and East Africa. Rose oil distilled in enormous quantities from the roses cultivated in the gardens of Campania and the fields of Syria. These were raw materials of a fragrance industry that connected the bedchambers of Roman women to trading networks that stretched from the South China Sea to the British Isles. Ovid recommends in his cosmetic poems that a woman should smell pleasant but not overwhelming. That the best perfume is one that makes itself known without announcing itself. That lingers on the skin and the clothing in a way that it is discovered rather than declared. The Roman market for cosmetics and beauty preparations was supplied by a network of specialist traders, the unguentarii or perfumers, who sold their wares from small shops in the commercial districts of Roman cities, and by a large informal economy of home production, in which women prepared their own beauty preparations from recipes circulating in the oral tradition of the household. Ovid's Medicamina Faciae Femininae includes several such recipes. A fussy mask made from crushed barley, eggs, staghorn ashes, narcissus bulbs, and honey, a preparation for removing freckles involving the lees of wine. A tooth-whitening preparation involving pumice and the horns of young deer. These preparations sit somewhere between cosmetics and medicine, and their cultural categorization. And their ingredients reveal the connection between Roman beauty culture and the broader world of ancient pharmacology. The same substances that were used to beautify the face, in different concentrations and combinations, used to treat skin diseases, fevers, and internal complaints. Chapter 3. The house of a Roman beauty. Her world, her walls, the architecture of female space, the physical world that a wealthy Roman woman inhorgated, was organized, at least in theory, according to Popel's of gender segregation that limited her public presence and concentrated her domestic authority within the household walls. The Roman domus, the townhouse of the urban elite, was designed with a clear spatial hierarchy, placed the most put rooms at the front, facing and the most private rooms at the rear, where the women's quarters, the kitchen, and the garden were located. The atrium and the tablinum, the rooms where the male head of household conducted business. Visitors were public in character. The triclinium, or dining room, where dinner parties were held, was semi-public. The cubicula, or bedchambers, and the gardens were private. A respectable married woman was expected to be visible in the public spaces of the house, when appropriate. A dinner party, these, in the atrium, when receiving visitors, her husband approved. But her primary domain understood to be the private interior. In practice, the spatial boundaries were considerably more permeable than this theoretical framework suggests. Roman women of upper classes moved through the city with greater freedom than the literary sources sometimes imply. They attended the theater and the public games. They visited temples and made offerings at the shrines throughout the city. They went to the public baths, in the women's hours, in the women's sections of the bath buildings, and they conducted commercial and legal business in their own names with a regularity that the surviving documentary evidence confirms. A wealthy woman's litter. The Curtinian vehicle in which she was carried through the streets by trained slaves was a form of mobile private space that allowed her to move through the city while maintaining the appearance of domestic enclosure. The curtains of the litter could be drawn to provide complete privacy or open pin to display the occupant in all her elaborately adorned splendor, depending on whether the occasion called for discretion or display. The garden of a wealthy Roman domus was one of the most important spaces in the domestic world of its female inhabitants. Roman domestic gardens, the peristyle gardens that opened off the rear of the house, and the larger orti, or pleasure gardens that the wealthiest families maintained on the outskirts of the city, were elaborately designed outdoor rooms furnished with sculpture, fountains, flowering plants, and fragrant herbs in combinations that reflected both aesthetic preference and a sophisticated understanding of botanical horticulture. A woman who spent her days in such a garden was not in retreat from the world. She was a carefully designed environment that connected her to the natural world while maintaining the privacy appropriate to her status. The garden was where she received her female friends, supervised the education of her children, wrote letters, and engaged in the management of the household affairs that were her recognized domain. Marriage, household, and the management of wealth. The social and economic position of a wealthy Roman woman was defined primarily by her marriage. But the nature of that marriage and the legal framework surrounding it gave Roman women of the upper classes considerably more autonomy than their counterparts in classical Greece or in most subsequent European civilizations until the 19th century. By the period of the late Republic and the Empire, the most common form of upper-class Roman marriage was the marriage sine manu, a marriage in which the wife did not legally pass into the authority of her husband but remained under the nominal authority of her father, and after her father's death, effectively became legally independent. Under this system, a wealthy Roman woman retained ownership of her own property, including the dowry she brought to the marriage, and could, in theory, conduct legal and commercial transactions in her own name without requiring her husband's permission. This legal framework had real practical consequences. Roman women of the propertied classes appear in the documentary record as property owners, lenders, investors, and business operators in numbers that challenged the image of the entirely secluded Roman matron. The archive of the businesswoman Caecilia Metella, preserved in a set of legal tablets from Pompeii, documents a woman who was actively engaged in real estate transactions, lending, and commercial investment during the mid-1st century CE, operating through a male representative called a tutor, but making the substantive decisions herself. The correspondence of Cicero contains numerous references to women who managed substantial estates, negotiated loans, and exercised real economic influence in the social networks of the Roman elite, including his own mother, his wife Terentia, and his daughter Tullia. The management of the household, the domus in the comprehensive Roman sense of the word, which included not only the physical house, but the entire economic and social unit of the family and its slaves, was the recognized domain of the Roman materfamilias, and the authority exercised within it was genuine. A wealthy Roman woman supervised a staff of potentially dozens of slaves, each assigned to a specific function. The Atrienses who managed the household's accounts and slave roster, the cooks, the cleanerin, the doormen, the secretaries, the wet nurses, the tutors for the children, the personal attendants already described. She negotiated with suppliers, managed food stores, supervised the education, oversaw the care of sick slaves, and maintained the social relationships, the visits, the dinner invitations, the gift exchanges that were the connective tissue of elite Roman social life. This was real work, and its execution required intelligence, organizational capacity, and social skill of a high order. Chapter 4. The education of a Roman beauty, mind, and letters. What a Roman one learned, be it a girl born into the Roman elite, was a subject of considerable discussion, and some disagreement in Roman literary culture, and the actual educational experiences of Roman women varied enormously depending on the period, the family, and individual circumstances of the girl in question. What is clear from the surviving evidence is that upper-class Roman women were, by the standards of most ancient cultures, remarkably well educated, and that a number of the most prominent women in Roman history were recognized by their contemporaries as genuinely accomplished intellectuals, writers, and musicians. The Roman ideal of feminine virtue did not exclude intelligence. It demanded it, up to a point. A Roman matron was supposed to be able to manage a complex household, to converse intelligently at dinner parties, and to participate in the cultural life of her social circle. What she was not supposed to do was compete publicly with men in the domains that Roman culture reserved for male performance: law, politics, philosophy, and rhetoric. In the early years of childhood, girls of the Roman elite received the same basic education as their brothers. Instruction in reading and writing, in arithmetic, in the elements of Greek and Latin literature, and in the physical disciplines of dance, music, and deportment that were considered part of the formation of a well-bred Roman body. This instruction was typically provided by a grammaticus, a private tutor hired by the family, or in some cases is by the child's own mother, who was expected to be literate and who was responsible for the early stages of her children's formation. The poet Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi and one of the most celebrated educated women of the Roman Republic, was renowned in an antiquity for the quality of the letters she wrote, and the central role she played in the intellectual formation of her sons Tiberius and Gaius. The education of Roman girls typically diverged from that of their brothers around the time of puberty, which in Roman practice meant around the age of 12, when a girl was considered marriageable and might be betrothed or even married, while a boy of the elite continued his education through advanced instruction in rhetoric, law, and law. A girl's formal education was more likely to be curtailed in favor of the practical preparation for the domestic role she was expected to assume, but the evidence suggests that many upper-class women continued their education formally throughout their lives, through reading, through the intellectual friendships that were an important component of Roman elite social life, and through participation in the literary circles that formed around prominent poets, philosophers, and patrons in every generation of the imperial period. The musical accomplishments. Music was one of the most important components of the cultivated Roman woman's accomplishments and the ability to play the lyre, air, and the cithara, the stringed instruments most associated with elite cultural performance, was as expected of an educated Roman girl as the ability and write. The lyre was closely associated with the Greek cultural tradition that Roman elite culture had enthusiastically adopted, and its mastery signaled both cultural refinement and the kind of patient, sustained discipline that Roman values admired. Young women of good family studied instrument with private teachers, practiced daily, and performed at dinner parties and family gatherings in a context that was understood as cultural display rather than professional entertainment, a distinction that Roman social life maintained with great care. The figure of the beautiful woman playing the lyre is of the most persistent images in Roman love poetry, appearing in Horace, Propertius, and Ovid as a conventional signal of educated femininity. But the convention was based on a real practice. The excavations at Pompeii and Herculaneum have recovered musical instruments, including lyres and alloy, from domestic contexts that confirm the presence of musical practice in the homes of wealthy women. The wall paintings of the Villa of the Mysteries at Pompeii depict a female musician playing a large strunged instrument in a ritual context, rendered with a specificity of detail that suggests the artist was familiar with the actual practice of female musical performance. Voices were also a prized accomplishment. The ability to sing well was mentioned by several Roman writers as part of the ideal of the educated woman and the instruction of the voice, in both speaking and singing, was an explicit component of the education that female slaves who were trained for refined entertainment received. Beyond music, some Roman women achieved genuine distinction as poets and writers. The poet Sulpicia, whose work survives as part of the corpus of Tibullus, is one of the few female Roman poets whose work has come down to us directly. Her 6 elegies, written in the 1st century BCE and addressed to a lover she calls Cerinthus, are remarkable documents of female interiority, written with the assured craft of someone who had fully internalized the conventions of the elegiac genre and used them to express experiences, perspectives that the genre's male practitioners rarely admitted. She writes about desire with a directness that her male contemporaries sometimes affected but achieved. She writes about the social constraints on female self-expression with a wry self-awareness that makes her seem remarkably modern. She was not unique. Roman literary history includes references to other female poets and writers whose work has not survived, figures like Sappho of Lesbos, who were invoked as models and predecessors by Roman women who wrote Captor, Topper, Love, and Eustangius. The emotional lives of Roman women, marriage, Zan desire, the emotional lives of Roman, the upper class lashed by a fundamental tension between the institution of marriage, which was primarily a social and economic arrangement between families contracted for strategic rather than romantic reasons, and the desire for personal emotional fulfillment, that the same literary culture that arranged these marriages simultaneously celebrated in its poetry and novels. Roman elite marriages were typically arranged when both parties were young, sometimes very young. It was legally possible for a girl to marry at 12, and while many families waited until the bride was somewhat older, Marriages in the mid-teens were common in the Republican and early imperial periods. The groom was typically older, often significantly older, than the bride, and the social expectation of the marriage was that the wife would produce legitimate heirs, manage the household competently, and maintain the social respectability of the family. This is not to say that Roman elite marriages were universally loveless, or that affection and genuine emotional connection never developed within them. The surviving letters and inscriptions of the Roman period include many examples of genuine marital warmth, of husbands describing their wives with evident admiration and affection, of wives whose grief at their husbands' deaths was clearly more than the performance of social convention. Pliny the Younger's letters to his young wife Calpurnia are remarkable for the tenderness they express. He writes that he misses her with a physical ache when they are apart, that he reads her letters multiple times and takes them out again in the night to sleep with them, that the sound of her lute playing in an adjacent room is enough to make his work seem less difficult. These letters suggest a genuine emotional partnership that complicates any simple picture of Roman marriage as purely instrumental, but the literary record also documents with considerable frankness the reality that many Roman elite marriages did not provide this kind of satisfaction, and that women, the upper classes, who were unhappy in their marriages, had various strategies available to them. Divorce in ancient Rome was relatively straightforward, at least in legal terms. Either party could initiate it, and by the period of the empire it required nothing more than a statement of intent and the return of the dowry. Roman satirists complained constantly about the frequency of divorce among wealthy women, a complaint that, when stripped of its misogynistic framing, confirms that Roman women of the elite did exercise the right to end satisfactory marriages with a freedom that women in most subsequent European civilizations did not enjoy until the 20th century. The philosopher Seneca notes, with apparent bewilderment, that wealthy women counted their years not by the names of the consuls, but by the names of their husbands. The world of the poet's mistress alongside, and sometimes overlapping with the world of elite marriage, was the parallel world celebrated in Roman love elegy, the world of the puella, the girl or mistress, whose beauty, intelligence, and emotional unavailability drove the elegiac poet to the heights of lyrical achievement and the depths of personal misery. The mistresses of the Roman elegists, Catulus's Lesbia, Properus's Cynthia, Tibullus's Delia, and Nemesis, Ovid's Corinna, are among the most famous women in Latin literature, and their fame rests on the extraordinary poems written about and to them by men who were simultaneously obsessed with their beauty and driven to distraction by their independence. Whether these women were real individuals, composite portraits, or largely literary constructions, is a question that classical scholars have debated for centuries, and will probably never definitively resolve. What is clear is that they represent a type that Roman culture recognized. The educated, beautiful, socially ambitious woman of uncertain social standing, who lived by her wits, her charm, and her ability to attract the devotion of wealthy and talented men. Propertus's Cynthia is the most fully realized of these figures. She appears across 4 books of elegies as a woman of extraordinary beauty and formidable intelligence, learned in literature and music, possessed of a sharp tongue and an equally sharp understanding of her own value. entirely unwilling to confine herself to the passive role that Roman convention prescribed, the object of male devotion. She reads and writes poetry. She plays the lyre. She goes to religious festivals and dinner parties from which she returns at inconvenient hours. She conducts other relationships while maintaining her connection with the poet. She is described as domina, mistress in the sense of one who exercises authority, and the term is not merely metaphorical. The dynamic of the elegiac relationship inverts the normal gender hierarchy of Roman society, placing the woman in the position of power and the man in the position of suppliant. This inversion was part of the game, and both parties in the real relationships, the poems describe, apparently understood and enjoyed it. The women who occupied this social position, the educated courtesans and independent women who moved in the literary and philosophical circles of Rome, were known by various terms that reflected the ambiguity of their social status. The meretrix was a woman who exchanged sexual favors for payment. The amica was a female friend whose relationship with a man might be sexual, but was defined primarily by its social character. The docta puella, the learned girl, was a specifically literary concept, the woman who participated in the culture of poetry and philosophy, something approaching equal terms with her male companions. These categories overlapped in practice, and the social reality was considerably more fluid than the legal categories suggest. What the surviving evidence confirms is that Rome's cultural world included a significant number of women who existed outside the formal structures of marriage and the household economy, who supported themselves through the patronage of wealthy men, and who exercised a degree of social and intellectual freedom that the wives of senators and equestrians could not always match. Chapter 6. Women Omen of the Imperial Palace. Power in the shadow of the throne. Livia, the first empress. No survey of the most influential women Roman history can begin. The most dangerous. Born in 58 BCE into one of the great families of the Roman Republic, Livia was first married at the age of about 15 to Tiberius Claudius Nero, by whom she had two sons, the future Emperor Tiberius and his brother Drusus. She was heavily pregnant with her second child when Augustus, then still Octavian, met her and immediately determined to have her. Her husband was persuaded to divorce her. She gave birth to Drusus and then, within days, married Octavian. It was one of the most significant marriages in the history of Rome, and it lasted 51 years. Until Augustus's death in 14 CE, contemporary portraits and ancient descriptions agree that Livia was physically striking, tall, dignified, with the kind of composed and formidable presence that Roman culture associated with the highest female virtue. She was also intensely politically intelligent, and over the course of half a century as Augustus's wife, she developed a degree of influence over Roman affairs that had no precedent in Roman history. She interceded with Augustus on behalf of petitioners, managed correspondence with foreign rulers, supervised the education of her sons and grandsons, and maintained a network of personal relationships, tips, and obligations, made her one of the most important nodes in the social network of the Roman elite. Augustus consulted her, or so ancient accounts suggest. He noted her opinions in writing and read them aloud in public contexts where women were not expected to speak. After Augustus's death, Livia was adopted into the Julian clan by his will and took the name Julia Augusta, a public recognition of her importance to the dynasty that he had created. She lived another 15 years, to the age 86, maintaining her social and political influence through the reign of her son Tiberius in a relationship that ancient sources describe as deeply ambivalent on both sides. Tiberius, who was 55 when he became emperor and who had spent decades in his mother's shadow, resented her influence with a bitterness that he struggled to conceal. He refused to give her the title of Mater Patriae, Mother of the Fatherland, that the Senate proposed. He declined to attend the games she gave in honor of Augusta's memory. When she died in 29 CE, he was as in self-imposed exile on Capri and did not return to Rome for her funeral. After her death, the Senate voted her divine honors. Tiberius vetoed them. Claudius, her grandson, eventually deified in 42 CE. She had outlived her husband, her son's willingness to honor her, and the political world she had helped to create, and she remained, to the end, more formidable than the men who tried to contain her. Agrippina the Younger, the mother who made an emperor if Livia, represents the first generation of imperial women, operating primarily through informal influence and the cultivation of personal relationships. Agrippina the Younger represents something more explicit and more dangerous, a woman who understood power as power, who pursued it directly and without apology, and who paid the ultimate price for her ambition. Born in 15 CE, the daughter of the great general Germanicus and the elder Agrippina, she was one of the most politically connected women in the Roman world from birth. She survived the murderous court of Caligula, her own brother. She was briefly exiled when she was implicated, probably falsely, in a conspiracy against him. She outlasted him. Caligula was assassinated in 41 CE, and her uncle Claudius became emperor. Agrippina married Claudius in 49 CE, a marriage that required a change in the law prohibiting marriages between uncles and nieces. She was 33. Claudius was 57, politically uncertain, and easily managed. Within months of the marriage, she had maneuvered her son Nero into the succession ahead of Claudius's own son, Britannicus, securing Nero's adoption and his betrothal to Claudius's daughter Octavia. Claudius died in 54 CE. The sources are unanimous in attributing his death to poisoned mushrooms administered Agrippina's direction, though whether this is historical fact or political slander directed at a woman who already being scapegoated by the Neronian court is impossible to determine with certainty. What is certain is that at Claudius's death, Agrippina was at the height of her power, and her son Nero was on the throne. The early years of Nero's reign were shaped by Agrippina's influence to a degree that the surviving sources clearly found extraordinary. She appeared in public by Nero's side at official functions. She received the salutation of military delegations. She was depicted on coins beside her son, face to face, an unprecedented visual statement of shared imperial authority. Ancient portrait busts show her in the later years of her life as a formidable figure. High cheekbones, a strong nose, an expression of controlled intelligence that suggests the personality that the literary sources describe. She was formally designated by a title usually reserved for the emperor's mother that had never been used as an instrument of joint rule. As he grew into his role and the influence of advisors like Seneca and the prefect Burrus began to resent his mother's authority. In 59 CEE, he arranged her murder. The famous episode of the collapsing boat, from which she swam to shore before being killed by assassins. She died at her villa at Baiae, reportedly drawing aside her clothing and pointing to her abdomen with the words, "Strike here." Whether she actually said this is, again, uncertain. What is certain is that the tradition preserved it because it was entirely in character. Messalina, and in the limits of scandal, the third wife of the Emperor Claudius, Valeria Messalina, has come down through history as the archetype of the sexually voracious and politically reckless Roman empress, the subject of some of the most vivid and most unreliable passages in the ancient historical tradition. Married to Claudius when she was perhaps 15 or 16 and he was 47 or 48, she was described by contemporaries as extraordinarily beautiful. Ancient sources agree on this, even when they agree on very little else about her character, with the kind of physical presence that made her unnoticeable in any setting. She bore Claudius 2 children who survived, a daughter named Claudia Octavia and a son named Britannicus. She was executed in 48 CEE at the age, perhaps 22 or 23, having allegedly contracted a bigamous marriage with a man named Gaius Silius, in what the sources describe as an attempt to displace Claudius. The ancient accounts of Messalina's behavior, in Tacitus, Suetonius, and Pliny the Elder, are saturated with misogynistic rhetoric of the Roman imperial tradition, the language of female sexual excess that was the standard vocabulary for attacking powerful women who could no longer defend themselves. Tacitus describes her organizing secret competitions in the palace. Pliny claims she challenged a professional prostitute to a contest of endurance and won. These accounts are very probably not factual descriptions of anything that had actually occurred. They are the products of a tradition that had decided Messalina was monstrous, and then generated the stories that monstrosity required. What the scholarly consensus now largely holds is that Messalina was as a politically active empress who made enemies among the imperial freedmen who managed Claudius's administration, that the alleged marriage to Silius may have been a genuine political conspiracy, or may have been fabricated by her enemies to justify her elimination, and that her execution, apparently carried out while Claudius was at dinner and had already begun to recover from whatever shock he had initially felt, was managed by others without his full understanding of what was happening. She died at 22, probably executed while crying out the name of her mother, Domitia Lepida, who was present but did not intervene. A chapter 7, the body politic, health, medicine, and the female, the body, the Roman medical tradition, and women's bodies, the medical understanding of the female body in ancient Rome, was shaped by a combination of Greek theoretical frameworks, practical empirical observation, and cultural assumptions about gender that were often more prescriptive than descriptive. The dominant theoretical framework was Galenic medicine, the system elaborated by the physician Galen in the 2nd century CE, building on the earlier work of Hippocrates and the Alexandrian medical tradition, which understood the female body as fundamentally different from the male in its physiology, colder and moister in its basic constitution, and therefore more susceptible to certain kinds of illness and requiring different kinds of medical management. This framework was not simply a neutral description of biological difference. It encoded assumptions about the relative completeness and adequacy of the female body that had cultural and social consequences. Gynecological medicine was a recognized specialty in the ancient world, and the surviving texts on the subject, including the Gynecology of Soranus of Ephesus, written in the early 2nd century CE, reveal a remarkably sophisticated practical knowledge of female reproductive biology coexisting with theoretical assumptions modern medicine has entirely rejected. Soranus describes the anatomy of the uterus, the management of normal and difficult childbirth, the treatment of gynecological conditions including prolapse and infection, and the care of the newborn and nursing infant with a clinical detail that reflects genuine hands-on experience. He was unusual in his era for his skepticism about the more extreme practices associated with gynecological medicine. He used, for instance, that virginity was not medically necessary for a woman's health, a position that challenged one of the standard assumptions of ancient gynecology. The practical medical care of upper-class Rome women was provided by a combination of male physicians, who might be called in for serious illnesses or complicated childbirth, and female specialists, whose role was the management of routine health concerns. The obstetrix, or midwife, was one of the most important figures in the medical world of Roman women. She managed normal childbirth, cared for the mother and infant in the period immediately following delivery, and in the case of difficult presentations, attempted the manual interventions that could mean between a successful delivery and the death of the mother, the infant, or both. The evidence suggests that skilled midwives were well regarded and reasonably well compensated in Roman society. The funerary inscriptions of midwives that survive from various parts of the empire record their profession with evident pride, and some of these women were clearly successful practitioners who had served wealthy clients throughout long careers. Childbirth, infant mortality, and the price of motherhood, even the wealthiest and most carefully attended women in ancient Rome. Childbirth was genuinely dangerous in a way that has no equivalent in the modern developed world. The combination, a limited understanding of infection and sepsis, the absence of the surgical and pharmacological interventions that can now rescue difficult deliveries, and the general health conditions of the Roman population meant that maternal mortality in childbirth was significantly higher than anything modern obstetrics considers acceptable. The exact rates are impossible to determine with precision, but the best estimates of demographic historians suggest that perhaps 1 in 50 to 1 in 100 deliveries ended in the mother's death, a rate that, for a woman who might bear 5, 6, or more children over the course of her reproductive life, represented a significant cumulative probability of fatal outcome. The evidence for this danger is both statistical and personal. Among the women who appear in the historical and literary record, deaths in childbirth are disturbingly common. Cecilia Metella, the subject of one of Catullus's most moving poems, died young and probably in childbirth. Tullia, Cicero's beloved daughter, died in 45 BCE, shortly after delivering a premature child, probably of the fever that sometimes followed difficult deliveries, and that ancient medicine had no effective treatment for. Augustus's daughter Julia survived multiple pregnancies, but suffered repeated miscarriages. Agrippina the Elder, mother of Caligula and the elder Agrippina, bore 9 children, 3 of whom did not survive infancy. The repeated experience of pregnancy, childbirth, and infant death was a constant feature of the lives of Roman women of all classes, and its emotional and physical toll was enormous. Upper-class women had access to better nutrition, better living conditions, and better medical attendance than poor women, and this advantage showed in their survival rates. But even the best medical care that the ancient world could provide was as of limited effectiveness against the complications that could turn a normal delivery into a life-threatening emergency. The Roman legal system recognized the danger of childbirth by providing specific legal protections for pregnant women. A woman who had been condemned to death could not be executed until after she had given birth. A woman who was pregnant when her husband died was entitled to special provisions from the estate until the delivery was complete. These protections are a small, telling acknowledgement of the vulnerability of the pregnant body and the social importance of safety in a world that needed children and knew, from constant experience, how uncertain their arrival was. Chapter 8. The banquet and beyond deity, social life and entertainment, the dinner party as theater, the Roman dinner party. The Senate was the central institution of elite social life, and the question of the role that women played in it eliminates many of the central tensions of Roman gender culture. In the classical Greek world, respectable women were excluded from the symposium entirely, relegated to a separate part of the house, while their husbands dined and drank with male companions. In Rome, the rules were different and considerably more complex. Roman elite women were present at dinner parties. This is confirmed by numerous literary references and by the physical evidence of dining rooms furnished with couches that were clearly designed to accommodate mixed-gender gatherings. But their presence was regulated by conventions that distinguished between the behavior appropriate to a matron and the behavior appropriate to other categories of female dinner guest. Respectable Roman matrons reclined at table alongside their husbands and ate and drank with the rest of the company. This was a significant difference from Greek practice, and ancient sources note it with some surprise. The Greek historians and philosophers who wrote about Roman customs sometimes mention the mixed dining as evidence of the unusual freedom enjoyed by Roman women, and it is clear that they found it. Remark: the quality of the food and wine at an elite Roman dinner party was extraordinary by any standard. The menus that survive in literary sources include multiple courses of seafood, game, and roasted meats with spices imported from the far reaches of the empire, wines from Campania, Falernium that were aged for decades before drinking, desserts of fresh and preserved fruits, honey cakes, and the elaborate confections that Roman pastry making had perfected. The table service was of silver and gold. The dining room was lit with the light of dozens of oil lamps set in elaborate bronze candelabra. The female guests at an elite Roman dinner were expected to contribute to the intellectual and social atmosphere of the evening, to converse intelligently, to appreciate the poetry and music that formed part of the entertainment, to manage the social dynamics of a table that might include political, rivals and awkward guests, with the graceful social intelligence that was one of the recognized accomplishments of the educated Roman woman. The hostess in particular had a significant social role. She had organized the invitation list, supervised the preparation of the food, managed the household staff, whose labor made the evening possible, and maintained the social atmosphere of the gathering with the same combination of hospitality and authority that defines the role of the skilled hostess in any culture. It was her success or failure that determined whether the party was remembered as a triumph or an embarrassment. The baths, the theater, and the public spaces of beauty outside the domestic setting, Roman women of the upper classes participated in a public social life that was, by the standards of most ancient and many later cultures, remarkably active. The great public baths of Rome and the provincial cities were among the most important social institutions of Roman urban life, and women used them, either in designated women's hours, in separate sections of the bath building, or in entirely separate establishments. The bath was not merely a venue for physical cleanliness. It was a social space where friendships were maintained, business was conducted, and the latest news of the city was exchanged. Wealthy women brought their personal attendants to the bath and were accompanied by, the same household staff who served them at home. The public bath was, in this sense, a projection of domestic space to the public sphere, a way of maintaining the social standards of the elite environment in a setting was theoretically accessible to everyone. The theater was one of the most public entertainment venues for Roman women of all social classes, and the evidence suggests that women attended theatrical performances with considerable enthusiasm and considerable frequency. The great theaters of Rome, the theater of Pompey, the theater of Marcellus, were enormous structures capable of accommodating tens of thousands of spectators, and their seating arrangements reflected the hierarchical organization of Roman society, in which women had a designated, if not entirely, comfortable place. Augustus, in one of his many attempts to regulate public morality, decreed that women should sit in the upper tiers of the theater, separated from the men below. But the evidence suggests that this regulation was more often honored in the breach than in the observance, and that women of the elite routinely found to sit where they preferred. The amphitheater and the chariot races of the Circus Maximus were also major destinations for Roman women, and the evidence of the literary sources suggests that the gladiatorial games and the races generated among female spectators a level of emotional intensity that their male contemporaries found alarming. The poet Juvenal, complaining about the moral degradation of his era, describes women who become infatuated with gladiators, who spend their days at the training schools pressing gifts and money on the fighters they admired, who left their husbands for men who were enslaved and social ousts, but who possessed the combination of physical beauty and lethal competence that the arena cultivated. Ovid, more sympathetically, advised young men to attend the races as the ideal place to meet women in a setting where football proximity, shared excitement, and the social license of public entertainment created the conditions for romantic acquaintance. The amphitheater and the circus were, in their way, the singles bars of ancient Rome, kept religion, and the sacred. women's spiritual lives. The Vestal Virgins, the most sacred female religious office in Rome, was also the most demanding and the most paradoxical. Vestal Virgin, priestess of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, who tended the sacred flame of Rome in the circular temple of Vesta at the foot of the Palatine Hill. There were 6 Vestal Virgins at any given time, serving terms of 30 years, 10 years learning their duties, 10 years performing them, and 10 years teaching their successors. They were selected in childhood, between the ages of 6 and 10, from the families of the Roman elite, chosen by the Pontifex Maximus on the basis of physical perfection, good family, and freedom from physical defect. At the moment of selection, the chosen girl passed out of her father's legal authority and into the authority of the state, a unique legal status that gave her, simultaneously, the most constrained and the most legally independent existence available to any Roman woman. The Vestals lived in the house of the Vestals, the large complex adjacent to the Temple of Vesta in the Roman Forum, in conditions that combined the physical comfort of elite domestic life with the ritual constraints of their priestly office. They were served by their own household staff. They dined well. They dressed in distinctive white robes and the elaborate headdress called the vitae. They had seats of honor at all public performances and ceremonial events. Their litters had the right of way in Roman streets, and any criminal they encountered on the way to or from an official duty was automatically pardoned by their presence. Their intercessory power was real. They could plead with the emperor on behalf of condemned men, and the historical record shows that this power was exercised and respected. The penalty for the violation of Vestal chastity, the most serious crime a Vestal could commit, because the chastity of the Vestals was understood as directly connected to the safety and prosperity of Rome, was burial alive in an underground chamber on the Campus Celeratus, the field of crimes, outside the city walls. This happened several times in Roman history, most notoriously in 83 BCCE, when 3 Vestals were accused of unchastity and chastity and condemned. And the ancient sources treat these episodes with a mixture of horror and ritual solemnity that reflects the profound importance of the office. Modern scholars have debated some or all of these condemnations were political fabrications. The Vestal was a figure of such symbolic importance that destroying one was a way of attacking the stability of the state, a charge that could be weaponized. But the cases themselves, real or constructed, were deadly in their consequences for the women concerned. The private cults, eis bona dei, and female devotion beyond the formal public religion of the Roman state, which was predominantly and nightly administered by male priests and organized around civic purposes. Roman women maintained a rich tradition of personal and female-specific religious practice that gave them access to sacred experiences and divine relationships that the official cult largely denied them. The worship of Isis, the great Egyptian goddess who had spread across the Mediterranean world during the Hellenistic period and been enthusiastically adopted by Roman women of all social classes, was perhaps the most significant of these alternative devotional systems. The Isis cult offered her female worshippers something that Roman state religion rarely provided. A goddess, who was herself a woman, who had suffered loss and struggled for her family, who was at once powerful and compassionate, and whose mysteries gave her initiates a personal transformative encounter with the divine that went far beyond the civic obligations of the public religion. The festivals of Isis were among the most elaborate public ceremonies in the Roman religious calendar, and they were managed by professional priests who were themselves often women or eunuchs, figures who existed outside the standard gender categories that the Roman state religion enforced. The initiation into the Isis mysteries, described with breathtaking vividness in Apuleius's novel The Golden Ass, was a profoundly personal religious experience that the initiate understood as a death and rebirth, a descent into the darkness of the underworld followed by a restoration to light and a new relationship with the divine. For Roman women who lived in a world where so much of their experience was bleak and regulated and performed for the benefit of others, this private, interior, transformative experience had an obvious and powerful appeal. The rites of Bonadi, the good goddess, were the most exclusively female religious ceremonies in the Roman calendar, conducted annually at the house of a senior magistrate's wife, attended only by women, and so strictly guarded from male knowledge that the content of the rites was one of the genuine secrets of Roman religious life. Men were excluded absolutely, not only from attendance, but from knowledge of what happened, to the point that even the name of the goddess, which was known but rarely used, was not to be spoken by men in female company. The scandal of 62 BCE, when the ambitious and reckless Publius Clodius Pulcher disguised himself as a woman and entered the rites being held at Julius Caesar's house, was understood by all parties, including Clodius, who was prosecuted for the sacrilege, as a profound violation of a specifically female sacred space. Caesar divorced his wife Pompeia because of the incident, famously saying that Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. But the real victim of the affair was the violated sanctity of the female mysteries, and Roman women's outrage at the violation was genuine and politically significant. Chapter 10, Slun, clashing, jewelry, and the language display, the grammar of Roman dress, the clothing of a wealthy Roman woman, was one of the most elaborate and socially significant components of her public self-presentation, and its details communicated information about her social status, her marital condition, and her moral character with a precision that a Roman viewer could read at a glance. The basic garment of the Roman woman was the stola, a long overdress that fell to the feet and was gathered by a belt below the bust, worn over the tunica that served as an undergarment. The stola was the distinctive dress of the married Roman woman of good standing, the matron, and its presence announced respectability as clearly as its absence announced the opposite, a woman who was not entitled to wear the stola because she was unmarried or a freedwoman or a woman of questionable reputation, wore only the tunica in public, a garment that marked her differently in the eyes of Roman law and Roman social convention. Over the stola, the Roman matron wore the palla, a large rectangular piece of cloth draped over the head and body in a manner analogous to the Greek himation. The palla was the street garment of the respectable Roman woman, drawn over the head when she went out in public as a modest covering that announced her respectability to onlookers. The quality of the fabric from which these garments were made was one of the primary expressions of wealth in Roman female dress. The finest wool from Miletus, silk from the East that was worth its weight in silver, linen of the finest Egyptian grade, The dyeing of textiles was another dimension of luxury. Tyrian purple, extracted from the murex sea snail in a process that required enormous quantities of shellfish per pound of dye. It was most expensive colorant in the ancient world, and was associated primarily with the imperial family and the highest grades of the senatorial aristocracy. The Roman sumptuary laws, the repeated legislative attempts to limit the display of luxury, were directed primarily at female dress, which suggests both the importance of clothing as a marker of status and the degree to which wealthy women's sartorial ambitions consistently outran whatever limits the law tried to impose. The Lex Appia of 215 BCE passed during the crisis of the Punic Wars, when Rome was trying to limit expenditure, prohibited women from wearing more than half an ounce of gold, from wearing multicolored garments, and from riding in carriages within the city and its environs unless going to a religious ceremony. It was repealed in 195 BCE after the women of Rome staged a protest so effective, filling the streets and the approaches to the Forum in numbers that prevented the male voters from reaching the assembly, that the historian Livy describes it as a genuinely alarming demonstration of female action. The law was gone within 20 years. Jewelry and the architecture of adornment, the jewelry of wealthy Roman women, was among the most magnificent produced by any ancient civilization. And the surviving examples, in the collections of museums from Naples to London to New York, demonstrate a level of goldsmithing and gemstone work that has rarely been exceeded in any subsequent period. Roman jewelers worked in techniques that included filigree, granulation, houpousse, and even all-inlay, combining these with an extraordinary range of gemstones that came from across the Roman world and beyond. Emeralds from Egypt and the Red Sea coast, sapphires from Ceylon, garnets from Bohemia, India, pearls from the Persian Gulf and the waters off Britain, amber from the Baltic coast, carnelian from Arabia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. The trade networks that supplied the Roman jewelry market connected the workshops of Rome and the provincial cities to every corner of the known world. Pearls were perhaps the most socially charged of all the Roman luxury gemstones, the one that appeared frequently in the literary sources as a symbol of extravagant female expenditure and the moral decay associated with it. The story of Cleopatra, told by Pliny the Elder and several other ancient sources, who dissolved one of the largest pearls in the known world in a cup of wine vinegar and drank it, to win a bet with Mark Antony about who could consume the most expensive dinner in history, is probably not literally true, but is entirely representative of the place pearls occupied in the Roman imagination of female excess. Pliny records pearl prices with a trembling specificity that reveals how much he cared about them. He knew the weight, the history, and the provenance of the most famous examples in the Roman world, and he described Roman women wearing multiple pearl earrings with the pained disapproval of a man who has calculated exactly how much each additional pearl was costing the Roman economy. The jewelry of the Villa of Boscoriel, a treasure of gold jewelry, silver vessels, and gold coins discovered in 595 near Pompeii, where it had been buried by its owner during the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE, is one of the most evocative survivals from the Roman world. The gold armlets, the necklaces of emerald and gold, the rings set with engraved gemstones, the gold hairnets and tiaras that form part of the collection represent the personal adornment of a wealthy Roman woman of the 1st century CE, assembled and hidden in a moment of crisis and never recovered by who hid it. She did not survive the eruption. Her jewelry did, and it carries across 2,000 years an entirely personal statement about how one Roman woman chose to present herself to the world. Chapter 11. The Poetisa Muses, beautiful women who inspired great literature. Claudia Metelli. Les Unmasked. Of all the women who served as the subjects and inspirations of Roman love poetry, none has been more thoroughly analyzed, more intensely debated, or more persistently misunderstood than Claudia Metelli, the woman whom the poet Catullus immortalized under the pseudonym Lesbia and addressed in some of the most devastating and most beautiful poems in the Latin language. She was the daughter of Appius Claudius Pulcher, the sister of the notorious Publius Clodius Pulcher, and the wife of the consul Quintus Caecilius Caecilius Metellus Celer, who died in 59 BCE. She was, by all contemporary accounts, exceptionally beautiful, highly educated, brilliantly witty, and wholly indifferent to the social conventions that Roman society prescribed for women of her standing. Her affair with Catullus, which is the subject of the poems that address Lesbia, was apparently conducted in Rome during the late 60s and early 50s BCE, when she was a married woman in her 30s, and he was a young man from Verona, making his way in the literary world of the capital. The poems Catullus wrote to and about her span the full arc of a devastating romantic experience. The ecstatic early period ODAMO, the famous phrase that captures the paradox of loving and hating simultaneously. The period of cooling, when he recognized that her feelings for him were not what he had believed them to be. The final bitterness and self-contempt that followed the end of the affair. What makes the Catullan poems extraordinary is not their narrative content, but their emotional precision. The way they capture states of feeling that anyone who has been in love and suffered for it will immediately recognize, in language of crystalline clarity that has never been equaled in any language for the expression of erotic misery. Claudia herself appears in another context that is equally illuminating. The speech Pro Clelio, delivered by Cicero in 56 BCE in defense of his former protégé Marcus Caelius Rufus, who had been charged by Claudia with attempted poisoning, an accusation that almost certainly arose from a broken personal relationship between them. Cicero's strategy was to destroy Claudia's credibility as a witness, and the methods he used, painting her as a woman of loose morals, implicating her in a relationship with her own brother, inventing a fictional conversation between her and her deceased husband in which the husband reproves her from the grave, are a masterpiece of forensic brutality that tells us a great deal about the vulnerability of even the most socially powerful Roman woman to public reputation destruction. Caelius was acquitted. Claudia disappears from the historical record after 56 BCE. Her fate is unknown. Poppaea Sabina. Beauty as a political weapon among the women of the imperial period. Poppaea Sabina stands out as one of the most remarkable examples of a woman who used her beauty with deliberate and sustained political intelligence, and who paid for that intelligence with her life. Born around 30 CE to a family of high standing, her mother was renowned as one of the most beautiful women of her generation. Poppaea was twice married before becoming the mistress and eventually the wife of the Emperor Nero. She was, by all contemporary accounts, extraordinarily beautiful. Tacitus describes her as possessing every quality except goodness, a formulation that elegantly encodes the Roman male terror of beautiful women who are also intelligent and ambitious. He notes that she cultivated her reputation, played with men's passions while showing none herself, and calculated everything she did and said with the cold precision of someone who understood exactly the value of what she was offering and exactly what she wanted in return. Poppeia's path to the imperial throne required the removal of several obstacles. Nero's first wife, Claudia Octavia, whom he eventually divorced and then had killed. Nero's mother, Agrippina the Younger, whose murder Poppaea is supposed to have encouraged, and the resistance of the advisor Buros, and the philosopher Seneca, who were trying to restrain the emperor's wilder impulses. Whether Poppaea was actually the driving force behind any of these developments, or whether she was the convenient scapegoat onto whom the tradition projected the agency that it was uncomfortable attributing to Nero himself, is a question that cannot be finally answered. What is clearer is that she achieved her goal. She was married to Nero in 62 CE and elevated to the rank of Augusta, becoming the first empress since Agrippina to hold formal imperial status. The physical particulars of Poppeia's Bumus are described in the ancient sources with unusual specificity. Pliny the Elder records that she was renowned for the color of her hair, an unusual amber gold that became fashionable enough to create a color known as Poppeia's gold that Roman women tried to replicate with various dyeing preparations. She bathed in the milk of 500 she-asses, carried with her on journeys specifically for this purpose, a practice that Pliny presents as extravagant, but that reflects a real Roman understanding that milk proteins had softening and brightening effects on the skin. She invented or popularized bread-based face masks kept on overnight to maintain the skin's smoothness. These details are preserved because thus they were extraordinary enough to be remarkable. But they also suggest a woman who took her beauty very seriously as a professional and political asset, and maintained it with the same systematic ascetic attention that a politician would apply to his public image. Poppaea died in 65 CCE. Tacitus says Nero kicked her during a fit of rage while she was pregnant, an account that may or may not be accurate, and Nero is said to have been genuinely devastated by her death. He had her deified. He may have mourned her. He was also, in all probability, the person who killed her. Apology. The mirror and the monument in the Capitoline museums in Rome, there is a bronze portrait head of a woman that dates to the early 2nd century CE, the period of Tron and Hadrian. She is unknown. Her name has not survived. Her family is unidentifiable, and the circumstances of her life can be guessed at, but not confirmed. What has survived is her face. The careful modeling of the cheekbones, the slight fullness of the lips, the large eyes with their precisely rendered irises, and above all the elaborate hairstyle of her era. The stacked curls and crimped waves of early 2nd century fashion, captured in bronze with a virtuosity that makes the hair appear almost organic, as if it has simply grown into its elaborate configuration. She is looking slightly to the left, and is looking, unmistakably, something she finds interesting. We will never know her story. We know that she was wealthy. Such a portrait cost money. We know she cared enough about her appearance to commission a work of art that captured it. We know that she lived in a world that we have spent this documentary exploring. A world of elaborate beauty rituals and carefully managed social performances, of household economies conducted with intelligence and authority, of emotional lives that were considerably more complex than the simple categories of Roman gender ideology acknowledged, of spiritual experiences that offered something the public world could not. We know that she was real, that behind the bronze there was a woman who smelled of rose murder and had opinions about the quality of that season's wine, who argued with her husband and worried about her children, and had a friend whose company she preferred above all others. The history of beautiful women in ancient Rome is not, finally, a history of beauty. It is a history of intelligence applied to constraint, of influence exercised through the limited channels that a patriarchal society left available, of lives that were in many cases extraordinary, not despite the limitations imposed on them, but in some complex way because of the pressure those limitations created. Livia outlasted Augustus. Agrippina the Younger made an emperor. Claudia Metelli survived Cicero's most devastating forensic assault and kept the admiration of the city's literary world. Sulpicia wrote poems that have lasted 2,000 years. Poppaea bathed in ass's milk and dyed her hair the color of amber, and calculated her way to the highest position a Roman woman could occupy. And she did it with a precision of thought that Tacitus acknowledged even as he condemned it. These women looked into mirrors made of polished silver and saw themselves clearly. The particular color of their eyes, the way the morning light caught their hair, the expression that their faces made when no one was watching. They painted those faces and arranged that hair and put on the jewelry that announced who they were and went out into a world, simultaneously worshipped and feared them. They were beautiful, certainly, or some of them were, and beauty in ancient Rome was a form of power that the Romans understood with perfect clarity. But they were also, and more importantly, intelligent and calculating and brave, and sometimes reckless, and sometimes wrong, and sometimes exactly right. They were, in the fullest sense, human. And 3,000 years have not made them less so. End of narration script. How did the most beautiful women of ancient Rome live? A 4-hour voiceover do.